Welcome to session 3, Lived Experiences, Culture and Grief. It has been an absolute honor to be part of this wonderful workshop, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed hearing from our faculty as much as I have today. My name is Teresa Brewington. I'm an enrolled member of the Coharie tribe and a descendant of the Lumbee tribe. I'm the co-director of the American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health TTC K-12 School Supplement and a member of the GSVLI planning team. Due to this pandemic, Native people have had the largest positive cases, hospitalizations, and loss of lives due to COVID. In Native communities, we have also experienced many suicide clusters, especially amongst our younger generation. Having my own personal stories of grief throughout my life, and then I too had many loved ones die due to COVID. But my father-in-law stands out to me more often. He was a very traditional Native man, and because he was COVID positive at the time of his death, we were not able to bury him in his traditional Native ceremonies. This is something that my husband deals with daily and something that really resonates with me. That said, I am very humbled to be the moderator of the session and to be able to have a rich and meaningful discussion with our faculty today. This session is special because it's real, as our faculty may share real life experiences. Our faculty might be grievers themselves with their own personal stories, pitfalls, triumphs, and stories of wisdom. Our faculty, Monique, Roshni, and Monique, will also share what and how we can learn from those with lived experiences, different cultural grief narratives, and needs to inform our practices as providers and as real people. For their full bios, please check out the full program. We also offer GSVLI CVs to reference their works. My hope today is the same as what Megan Devine said earlier, even though I did have it written down. But I too hope that everyone here leaves with how we do this better, not just as practitioners, but as ourselves. So before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items that we do need to go over. Please share ideas, resources, thoughts that resonate with you in the chat box throughout your experience with us. Please make sure to send what you would like to share with everyone to attendees and panelists. Note, we welcome you to share what is resonating or connected ideas to the discussion. We do not, however, welcome any speech that evokes harm or is not productive. Please share specific comments to panelists in the chat dropdown. We welcome your questions through the Q&A box. You can directly chat with tech help at any point today. All sessions are recorded and will be on our event page 2 weeks after the event. Lastly, if you need to, you can access closed captioning feature simply by clicking CC button. You will also receive an email on how to access a certificate of attendance, but please note you will need to be in attendance for at least 2 hours. On that note, I want to ask our tech support to take down the slides so that we can meet our wonderful panelists. So let's meet our faculty today. First, we have Monique Castro.
Hi, Yatse, greetings everyone. Good afternoon, or I don't know if it's evening anywhere yet, but definitely afternoon here in Los Angeles. My name is Monique Castro. I am Dene, or also known as the Navajo Nation. I'm Navajo and Mexican. I grew up and was raised on Tonga land, which is in Los Angeles, California. And I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, a certified professional coach, the CEO and founder of Indigenous Circle of Wellness, which is a group private practice here in Los Angeles, providing support to Indigenous folks and really everyone throughout the state of California, as well as in other ways through wellness services throughout the country. And I'm also the co-founder and president, board president of our nonprofit, So Oshinala Sister Project. So I am so grateful to be here today, and we'll share a little bit more about myself so you get to know me, what brings me to this work, and what comes up when I think of our topic today, the theme of grief sensitivity. Where are we now and where are we going?
Miigwech, Monique. And next we have Monique Minam.
Finished.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I'm like, I wish our intros were that quick, but I have some more to share with you all.
I was going to introduce all three first and then go into that, but go right ahead, Monique.
So a little bit more about myself. So I was born and raised, as I mentioned, in Los Angeles on Tongva territory, in an area called Lincoln Heights. It's the area that my grandparents settled in after arriving here during the relocation era. So I am considered second generation off reservation, and have my lived experience as an urban native person here in Los Angeles. Both my grandparents raised me since I was a baby, and won't share too much about that full story. It's too much time, but definitely you'll see that a lot of my work is really grounded in who they are, what they've taught me, especially around grief and supporting community. My family's originally from the Window Rock area of the Navajo Nation, in and around the area there. And as I mentioned, came to Los Angeles during the mid to late 1950s. I shared 4 different circles here because these are kind of the 4 areas of grief that I have, I guess, wanted just to kind of highlight and in the work that I do. One is the grief and the loss of my grandmother, who passed on into the spirit world when I was 23 years old, right before entering my grad program. And as I mentioned, I was raised by her, so she was very much my mother figure and main caretaker and caregiver. And the next photo that I have is actually of myself as a child, growing up with, in a family that had a lot of challenges. I grew up very quickly. And so as I got older, I realized I really grieved the life of not really having much of a childhood. I grew up very quickly and took on a lot of responsibilities very early on, including starting to work at 12 years old, and providing and supporting family in a lot of different ways. So I wanted to acknowledge my younger self in my grief as well. The next photo here is my father, who passed on about 4 years ago. And it was really difficult, even though I think oftentimes folks think, well, it wasn't, this is actually something I heard. It couldn't have been that bad. You weren't raised by him. It was different. And that, of course, was really heartbreaking to hear. And, there was a lot that I had to unravel. I had a lot of also anticipatory grief with my father passing because he was very ill. And I knew that his passing was going to, wasn't too far away. So, I still have my moments, and we'll continue. And as we talk about grief in our communities and culture, we'll see that, it changes, but it is very fluid and it's not linear at all. The last photo here is actually a grief that I experienced this past year in May in 2021, and that is a pregnancy loss. And I had a miscarriage when I was at 9 weeks pregnant, and that was really hard, probably one of the most difficult experiences that I've ever had. And there's a lot that has come with that, and I'm still very much in that healing process and working through that grief. So there's been a lot of things in my life that I have grieved, and these are 4 areas that I think will probably kind of continue to come up during our discussion today. And I just wanted to highlight them and acknowledge that the grief, both from various parts of my life, how present they are in who I am, as well as in the work that I continue to do. Lastly, I wanted to just share again my grandparents, who are huge foundations to who I am in the community that I serve. As I mentioned, I primarily work with our Indigenous population, and my biggest teachers have been them. They have been my biggest teachers. I've learned so much from them. I continue to learn from them. Grandpa is still physically here in this world. As I mentioned, Grandma is in the spirit world, but they both continue to have a profound impact on the work that I do every day. And I also just wanted to share that, Grandpa actually lost his parents when he was 6 years old. So he has actually no memory of his parents. And a lot of the grief that he experienced, I'll share more about how in the discussion around how family and how we as a family have navigated through grief and loss, and even just displacement and being in different places and not being on our traditional homelands has also impacted both my grandparents and also us as their descendants. My grandparents have 5 children, 9 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren, and 2 more on the way, including my soon-to-be baby boy this July. So I'm very happy and excited. And also community of grandchildren, grandma and grandpa. You see them, they're everyone's grandma and grandpa, right? Grandpa loves it, and you can't even call him by his first name. He's like, nope, call me grandpa. So a lot of the continued work that I do is really their legacy and the continued healing of our communities, and just the love that they have and share, and how they provided so much support, and how I can continue to do that and have continued to do that through my work in various ways. So thank you again for having me, and I will go ahead and stop my screen share now.
Miigwech, Monique, thank you so much for that. And now I'm going to hand it over to Monique Minam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Oh, there's a slide. Nice. Okay. I just want to start by saying I'm so appreciative of being here with all of us, even though we can't see each other necessarily. It's definitely a felt sense of presence, and how each person who's here is holding up the edges of their own experience. The hard parts and the joyful parts, and from where I sit, that feels really supportive and connecting. So I just wanted to name that. My name is Monique Moynihan, and I am the creator and author of The Grief Practice. And it is an exploration and an explanation of grief in the body, pulling from the lenses of neuroscience and somatic science and movement science, and in a way that I find so beautifully sort of holds more of the soulful elements of loss. And that's one thing that I've really come to appreciate about sort of where I've landed in this field. So I provide somatic support to individuals and to groups, not really so that they can feel better, but mostly just so that they can feel into whatever is available in any given moment. And a big part of that is just naming what's happening from the neck down, how protective and adaptive and important that is, and how it relates to the stories that we tell and the way that we see the world and can ask for what we need. So this first slide kind of speaks to that part, which is when we can't feel better, we can feel accompanied, we can feel understood, we can feel connected, we can feel heard, we can feel held, and we can feel. So there's so many different channels of our experience, and these next couple slides, they're just things that have seemed to resonate with the communities that I interact with. And sometimes, especially in the wellness world, that can be so just almost hyper focus on we need to get better. And I find that there's so many other ways to support what's happening on all of the levels of our experience. So this is one thing that I find really helpful to name. And then the next slide I find myself often at this intersection of trauma and grief, especially from the level of the body. And it just kind of names one piece of that. We cannot grieve when our bodies are in shock. And this can often get overlooked because so often we don't realize that the impact, the emotional impact to our bodies, especially with traumatic loss, is no different than a physical insult or a physical impact. And so to make some room and some sort of understanding around our bodies are doing the best that they can, and something like a traumatic loss can really change the amount of grief that's available, the way that we can hold it. One of the communities that I work with a bit are humans who have lost a loved one by suicide. And so this often comes into play where once the part of our experience that wasn't able to complete or to connect, once that can be given some space and slow down a little bit, then there can be often just room for the grief to be whatever it needs to be felt. And then the last slide that I wanted to share was something that's really close to my heart, this idea of what's called eudaimonia, which is just the sense of well-being, and really appreciating that it's not dependent on things being well. Now I can give myself the gift of feeling okay, just for right now. I find that it can be so supportive for how we allow our grief to unfold, and also how we can sit and support other people as their grief moves in and sort of shape shifts in all the ways that it does. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Monique. I appreciate that perspective. That was very beautiful. And next we'll have Roshni Kavate.
Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much. I just noticed there's almost 550 people here in this Zoom portal. And I've been reading lately of our ancestors and how many ancestors we may have. And it's hard to fathom even like what number that is. So, we may come from even, 400 people, 500, even if we look at 500 of our relatives, that's thousands of people that we're sharing space with, their spirits, their selves, their hopes, their dreams. So I just want to take a moment to invite that energy, invite all of them in here. And we are here and they are here. So I'm just really honored to meet all of you. Again, my name is Roshni Kavate. I'm the founder of Cardamom and Kavate. It's a wellness grief platform dedicated to living our wild selves through rituals, ancestral practices, somatics, food, culture. My background is in nursing. I was a palliative care nurse for over 12 years, working in ICU with cancer patients in LA, New York, Oakland. And I grew up in India for 13 years, the first half of my life, and then in California for the rest of the time. And my family, they're a family of weavers. The stories my grandmother, my great-grandmother told me were of them, wearing these lovely golden, colorful draped saris. They would weave them in their homes, in the courtyard. And I've seen the looms, you hear the sound, the click, the clack of the warp and the weft. You see the colorful threads hanging. So that's where I come from. Those are my people. They're artists, they're entrepreneurs, they're dreamers. But because of British colonization and the oppression my family had to survive, we became survivors, from thrivers, dreamers to survivors. And that really imprinted a generation, many generations, our nervous system, like Monique was talking about. It really changed the way we dreamt, the way we thought what was possible. So in a matter of 2 generations, my family went from being artists to being, you know, survivors, very practical, like do what you need to survive, to eat, to live. So they had to leave their home. They had to travel 500,000 miles away from home to a new land. And I share this because even knowing where my family's from, I still don't know where they're from. We still don't know where our land is. So a lot of us carry this grief of not knowing our homeland, the smell of the, you know, the soil there. We don't know what foods our ancestors ate. And a lot of my work after leaving nursing from a hospital context is to talk about culture and who we are and how we grieve. And that is through our culture, that is through nurturing our grief. And I studied nutrition, and, you know, from a nutritional perspective, we talk a lot about craving, comfort food, and they're seen as very negative. But I want to reframe that and think about, you know, when we crave, what are we craving? You know, craving comfort, craving wisdom, craving healing, craving knowing, craving indigenous technology, right? That's healing. That's our wisdom. And what I've been grieving lately is I've been grieving my grandmother's cooking. I really, really, really miss her. You know, her lamb meatballs will cure anything. So I really need it. I really need it, and I don't have it. But I try to recreate it, but it's not the same. You know, I will never have her sambar masala recipe ever. It will never be the same, and that I grieve. You know, that wisdom. I'm also a postpartum doula and a birth doula. And I'm also grieving my own miscarriage. Monique, my heart goes out to you as well. And so I help birthing people navigate this loss. Again, birthing people need nurturing, need care, need softness, need holding. And that again is through traditional wisdom, traditional cultures. So I want to mention tradition and ancestral rituals because as a hospital clinician, we never talked about this. When you came into the hospital, we saw you as a blank, you know, that you were devoid of any culture. We looked at body parts, we looked at systems, we looked at diagnoses, you know, we looked at treatment options, but we never asked, you know, what do you crave when you're feeling down? Like, what does that mean? Tell me more about that. What's the story behind that? Instead, you know, we recommend, you know, go on this juice diet or, you know, eat more quinoa, eat more kale. So I want us to just start thinking about maybe taking a moment to think of a food memory, you know, that you crave when you're happy or when you're sad, when you're celebrating. What is that one food? Maybe imagining that. And even imagining we're all sitting at dinner tonight. It's nighttime for me. So, you know, and just thinking about like, what is on your plate? What are you bringing? And if you have a chance, you could share that in the chat box just so we can see just the diversity, the power of food, the power of, you know, what's in that food, the love, that sustenance that carries us through. And in terms of our theme for, you know, grief and sensitivity and where we go from here, I think the future is culture, the future is ancestral wisdom, the future is us and our stories, the future is our songs. It's rewriting what's been lost. I think it's talking about openly in spaces where it's not just, you know, limited to medical speak or quote unquote professional ways of talking about grief. It's shattering that like pedagogical understanding of grief. It's visceral, it's primal. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm excited to read what's in the chat box and devour it all.
Thank you very much, panelists. You all had very beautiful stories, personal stories that resonated with me very much so. So I appreciate that so much for telling your real life stories. I do have a few questions for you, if we could go into a couple of questions. And I wanted to start because a couple of things that I did hear during you guys' introduction is the word culture. Something very important to me as well. So my question to you is, what is the dominant culture miss or may not understand when it comes to grief? And without calling on you, I will go ahead and let whoever wants to chime in, just chime in first, if that's okay.
I can jump in. What comes to mind is kind of the how the animal of our body responds to loss. Sort of that primal instinctive, whatever it is that would have moved if it wasn't being polite or held back or not supported enough. So that's one thing that I think of, especially in the context of my own experience. It's been almost 20 years, but when I was 25, my husband suddenly died, and it was super, back, there wasn't the world of grief support that there is now. And then I also think, in other personal contexts where I've had 4 miscarriages, and just sort of the primal response and how that moved in me and didn't necessarily have words. And that's something that I think is just lost sometimes, because we're in such a hurry to either tidy up ourselves or tidy up other people and make it cognitive and understandable. And I think when we can go back, and everyone else has spoken to it so beautifully, but really in all of these really instinctual ways, just name it, honor it, make space for it. That's, that can be such, I guess we can use the word healing. But the other thing that came to mind is that sometimes overlooked is kind of missing what's underneath the behavior. It seems a lot of times with grief, what's looked at is like, how are people, acting or not acting, or what, and we sort of lose sight of what is the, under the iceberg, and like the physiological and biological responses that they might not even be aware of, that's creating the behavior and creating the narrative. And so I think those are things that could be really helpful, to sort of add to the conversation, because there's so many layers to it.
Thank you, Monique. Would anybody else like to answer that?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's always really interesting to me, like even different terms, how they don't always resonate with me. So for example, dominant culture, I just think of like Western colonization and how that has impacted how we grieve. And so like in my own lived experience, like, and even today, I am constantly surrounded by family and community. So what that looks like, I have more recently exposed to this like dominant culture of like how grief looks. And then I'm like, oh, you all don't do it this way? Like you all are not in family space together. You all not showing up to each other's houses with food. There's a lot of different things that I'm learning actually of more of this like Western way, because that has not been my experience. So a lot of the work that I do obviously is working with Indigenous community members, and I show up with them the ways in which I had learned to show up in my family, which is you open your home, you invite folks over, you show up to their houses, you provide a space, you hold space, and we're very comfortable in my family to talk about loss and grief and to honor our ancestors all the time. including celebrating their birthdays every year still, and acknowledging the days that they had passed and letting ourselves have that time and space. And then I've also worked in mostly Native organizations where, you know, where it was an understanding that some folks are going to take longer time off because they have to be in ceremony and there's travel time for that. Many of us are not on our homeland, so there's going to, you know, it takes time and all these different things. And so my experience has been very different from when people share their experiences sometimes in this like Western dominant culture. And I'm like, whoa, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, how can someone only have 3 days of bereavement, but if your family lives in another state and there's a ceremony, how is that even possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are these things that just kind of like, it confuses me. And I'm grateful that I have had my experiences and ability to be in space in this way that I realize not a lot of folks have. Right? Like if we think about, again, we're talking about dominant culture, like, oh, this isn't your experience. Being open to talk about, even within my own family, about the miscarriage. It was like, I had so much support from the very moment where my partner was also very supportive, but his family to this day have not mentioned it, have even acknowledged that I've had the loss, right? So it's very different. We come from very different cultures. So it's just really interesting how it just shows up differently and obviously in different communities. And so I just wanted to, I guess, name that and share that a bit. And, you know, as I'm hearing and learning about more like others folks' experiences, like what we're missing is the community care. I see is absolutely missing is that community care that is very much instilled in Indigenous communities. Community care is like, that is just part of who we are and the ways in which we show up for one another. So that,
Monique, I have to follow up with the question for you because you just said a lot of things that resonated with me. Yes, I agree. We call it Western civilization. How do you make that connection or that divide, I would say, when you're working with clients on what you're taught and then our traditional ways, and then what works best? Or do you do it individually depending on the client's needs or what you know about the client?
Yeah, so it's definitely, I would say, on the individual needs. Every person that I work with is, you know, has different traditions, different, you know, migration stories, different stories. So I really, in all the work that I do in my practice and even just holding space for folks outside of the work that I do as a therapist, it's really just meeting folks from where they're at and allowing them to share their story and really supporting them through that process, whatever that might look. What I have noticed though, because I am, you know, an Indigenous therapist, I feel like folks already feel very comfortable in sharing things with me that they have told me they will not share with another provider, which is, you know, one, maybe their connection to the spirit world and having those, you know, those different experiences with relatives who have transitioned into that spiritual realm, where they feel they can get really pathologized by a Western, like a therapist who really practices more in a Western way. So I think because of the type of practice in the space that we hold, there's a different level of openness and sharing. And a lot of the work that I do and the practice that we do is holding space for their experience and their story, whatever that might be. And some folks are more traditional. And I know when we talk in this space, but I've heard traditional or like traditional therapy. Again, that's Western therapy. Talking about traditional in an ancestral knowledge and wisdom in this at least speaking session. Because when I know it can get confused, it is another word that gets confusing when someone says traditional. So traditional, I have folks who I work with who are very traditional in their cultural practices. And so we talk about what is that going to look like in their process of their healing and what they plan to integrate or not, depending again on what their experiences and also what resources they have access to. And sometimes, especially here in LA, we got to get really creative on what that may look like. So yeah, I hope that answers a bit of that question.
It does. Thank you so much. And Roshni, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I wanted to add, when we talk about the dominant narrative, we're talking about colonization and it, the center of focus is capitalism. So what I think the dominant culture is missing, when it comes to grieving is, for me, the way I see it, grief is it's primal, it's guttural, it's ritualistic. It's feeling, like Monique was talking about, it's the animal side, the body just knows, coming alive, even when there's been so much loss. And I feel like the dominant culture, there's sort of a posture of silence. There's a physicality to grief, how it looks, how it feels, should come off as polite, not to, not feel actually. And if you look at cultures in the world and in my culture, when we grieve, there's a guttural crying. We, tap our chest. It's wailing. There's an art to grieving, right? And now there's a lot of fancy terms for it, or somatic discharge, whatever you want to call it. But it's a traditional practice that so many cultures do. We dance, we sing. So again, we bring in all those pieces to express all parts of our grief. And the way I talk about grief in my, at least in my family, we don't have the word grief. That doesn't exist. Neither does depression or anxiety, but we talk about physical symptoms. I have a stomach ache, my head hurts, I feel nauseous, I feel like a sense of something's wrong. So our grief is very much rooted in physical symptoms. And I think that, I hope, is the number one change that happens, is that it's not somehow limited to, neurons or mental, even, mental health. Like mental health is, an expression of your physical sense of being in this world, your sense of alignment and balance of feelings and so much more. So I hope we can expand the definition to include just all the sensations in our body, and that it doesn't get diagnosed as, it's psychosomatic. So then we treat it a certain way. That it's a full body expression, just like any other, experience of being alive is. Breathing is a full body, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual practice. So grief, is just that. And I hope that we don't talk about it as something that needs to be tamed or captured, that grief can, come alive, that it can soar, but then, it also can live in harmony with our body. So again, not pathologizing it, but, inviting it, letting us sort of like make friends with the grieving body for it to live in our body. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Let us doing it our own way, the way we need to heal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think, Roshni, you brought up my next question. My next question is, how might our social, cultural, and political structures impact our access to grief healing? And you already brought up a point earlier when you said that people need more time to grieve, whereas you may have a job that says you have to return to work in 5 days. So let's go into that question, and who would like to start?
I'll go. I mean, 5 days is luxurious bereavement time off, I should say. And that's, that's shocking that that's acceptable. Since we were touching on, pregnancy loss, like there is no bereavement for that, you don't get time off for that. So I think there's just, basic physiological needs that are not, I think, addressed, that we are fighting for politically, that, you know, that apparently does not make sense to most of lawmakers. So I would really think about the physiology of grief in talking about it, and not just, you know, why it's like money lost or why we need people. And I think destigmatizing grief and having to do it as like, oh, I have to go to therapy. But, you know, bringing grief to work, like integrating it, like everyone's grieving, like that's just universal. You know, just like we're born, like we celebrate birthdays, like everyone's grieving every day. So I think integrating it into the workplace and not having shame around it, at least where I worked in palliative care, where, you know, we love grief in the sense that we're very inviting, you know, we have a lot of rituals around it. And, you know, we would honor people who lost their lives that we worked with in this beautiful, you know, guarded ceremony. So I think, you know, little things like that can, you know, come into the workplace and can be a source of comfort for people. I think that's one way to go about it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The workplace, because we spend so much time there, and it's sometimes one of the areas that can be the most difficult and challenging, right? So when my grandmother had been ill and she was in her last 2-3 weeks on hospice, I spoke with my supervisor, and mind you, again, I was working for a Native organization. And so the policies, they get to really decide how things are going to be. And I believe they're just much more sensitive and culturally for our community, as many of the folks who work there are Native people. And I spoke with my supervisor and I said, my grandmother is on hospice and I would like to spend a week with her before she passes on. And then I'm going to need time afterwards. And I received so much love and care from my supervisor and the organization. Said, yes, please take the time, all the time that you need. Not only did I have the time, they still paid me for the time that I was off. I didn't expect that. So they gave me birth month ahead of time because they understood how important that was for me to be with my grandma by her side in her last living moments. And then of course I needed the time for you know, her services and to be with family and such. And even after the fact, they understood that there's a process, right? Like I'm not going to come back as this 100% back on, you know, just back into work. And I've always been a service provider, so someone who is showing up for others. And I shared with my clients at the time, I was a case manager, and they also understood. It was just so much community care in that, and I can't imagine what it would have been like if I didn't have that, right? And, you know, and there's other experiences that I could share, but it's huge. I mean, imagine if we had more of this care during these kinds of moments, like just how different we would experience it and like what that looks like. So, you know,
the caring for the people that are grieving is the big thing. Yes, people over profit.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, and of course, and now that I have my own business and practice, like, I mean, of course, that is something that is very much even instilled in the organization that I have, and making sure that I provide that type of care and support. So yeah, I mean, that's huge. And I'm, especially for folks who have you can make what I've also witnessed is that there is very much possibility in changing how these policies are made. It's just a matter of doing it, really.
Yes, it's doable. Absolutely. Yes. And then you have better productive workers out of it as well. And another thing I wanted to add that you mentioned, Monique, is even here in our community, when we have a loss, everybody leaves. We all, the whole community grieves. We don't have any activities. We cancel everything. Teachers are excused because they need to go and they need to be the cooks and the pallbearers and all these things. So the whole community comes together. So there is no question of you have to be working at a certain time. But again, that's the Western civilization that has changed these things. But yes, so thank you for that. Monique, did you want to add anything else, Monique Ilm?
Yeah, this conversation, it's reminded me when my husband died, his cousin was in the military, and she was like his sister, and they wouldn't give her the time to come. She was over on the East Coast and she wasn't able to come for his services. And it's, you know, it's interesting. That's what kind of came to mind as you were both speaking about it. And what a loss that was for her on top of him dying. But you know, what I think of with this idea of this, you know, sociocultural element is how much our environment impacts our sense of safety, and how much our sense of safety relates to how much we can grieve or allow ourselves to be in community or ask for what we need. And not just the sense of safety around the community and how they're responding, or our families or our friends, but also the, you know, the environment of being in a pandemic, like what that does to our sense of, you know, how safe are we feeling, like we're having to survive our days, or do we actually have a little room to move into the you know, what needs to be mourned. And just also the, you know, that relational safety, and how if it's not there, if it is there, it offers so much support, and if it's not there, then it can really challenge our resilience and our ability to move with and through these experiences. And I think of it, as you were both sharing, like as the communal container. You know, there's like the embodied container, and then there's a communal container, and so much of the communal container is impacting the inner experience, and how that can be held in. I mean, it's really beautiful just to hear the different cultures and the ways of support that it sounds like all of you have had, which is really, yeah, different from, you know, the Western way. So
Great conversation, ladies. Thank you so much. I'm going to move it a little bit to another question. Can you share some stories of grief healing? What are you seeing, noticing, and feeling? And I'll open that to anybody.
I'll just pick up. This question is so interesting to me. I think of grieving as healing. Like, I think the grieving is the healing. So when I think of stories of, you know, healing from grief, I think of it not so much as people having less pain, but maybe having more joy or more connection. And that's what I've seen in the communities that I work with, and the people that I know more of their stories, is not that they hurt any less, but, you know, that they start to find more pockets of things of their own aliveness, and ways that they can sort of re-enter and bring, you know, invite in parts of joy that they might not have been able to before. And it makes me think of my husband who died, his father, who I'm still close with. He's going to turn 80 next year. And I just talked to him last week, and he lost my husband who died, and then also my husband's sister, their only other child, had died. And now he's moved to a new house where across the street, he tells me there's a family with 3 kids, and the kids come and visit him, and he's able to, you know, tell them about his kids. And knowing, you know, for the last 20 years, his experience, to me, that is, you know, that's grief healing, is like he's able to allow that in and have that support, and all of the seen and unseen ways. So that's sort of what popped to mind.
Thank you. Anybody else want to ask that question? Answer that
Sure.
question?
Yeah, I think what I've seen is within sort of the enormity of grief, I see people surrendering. There is a surrender and a lot of gratitude, you know, and a continued interest in life in joy, in pleasure. We don't think about pleasure and grief connecting. There's always this like disconnect or negativity. But when grief is so palpable, I think the human instinct is to seek out pleasure and joy and feeling. So I think it can actually be a very beautiful invitation, to tap into like what brings you more pleasure. How can you access that? How can you make room for that, even in that sheer sort of heartbreak? And that's been the sort of, to me, that was magical when I saw that, and when I like heard about it and found out that's been a practice for me, that grief will never leave me. I will never be healed from it, but I can definitely cultivate more pleasure, more ease, more surrender.
Thank you.
Yeah, just really getting everyone's responses to this and thinking about this. For me, grief is very spiritual. It's very much a process that I think back to my grandparents, and even them sharing their different stories of their grandparents, their parents, leaving home, being in a different place, not being with their siblings, like all the different losses and experiences that they've had, but also having that connection, right? So I think of spirituality, I think of deep connection, and that continued connection, all that connection of life, and that intertwinedness, and the cycles. And for me and for my family, I mean, it's been through my hearing the grief, the stories, and the connections that my grandparents shared with me, is how I've been able to connect to my ancestors, right? And I was able to sit with my grandma through so much of her pain, but also the joys in which that she also shared in those stories, the missing of those moments, but also what she sees in her grandchildren, and what as she sees our future generations, right? So these are like the connections from our ancestors to our future generations, that it's been through the stories in that process. And I think someone mentioned this, like, we don't have necessarily these terms. I don't remember grandma saying I'm grieving, right? I just recognize that now as an adult and doing this work, it's like, oh, that's what was happening. But at the time, I just knew that these were connections that we had. And I also feel deeply about, after my father passed, me and my father had we had a very strong connection. And there's a lot of things that I realized, both during his time here physically, as well as when he entered the spirit world, was like, just so many things that was similar. Like, we have so many similarities, right? But those connections only deepened when he had passed on. And so that relationship got also stronger. And so these, sometimes I think with like Western culture, or maybe even in different cultures, is that there's like this ending, and I don't feel the ending. I don't ever feel that there's an ending of seeing them physically here, but I always continue to feel the presence of my family, and spiritually all the time, especially when in time of need, in various ways, and different in so many different ways that they may show up, right? Like, we just had a family gathering about a few days ago, and I seen two beautiful hawks in the sky circling our family, and everyone's like, look at the hawks, like that is your dad, and that's grandma, like they're here with us, right? And so I always feel connected. And so when I think of grief, and what it means and how it feels, it's very much a connection. It doesn't feel separated. I feel very much more connected.
Very true. Thank you for that. I agree with that as well. If you allow yourself to see the signs, you'll see the signs. I do believe that. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm curious to know this. And I was going to actually ask this question to Roshni, because I know that you're a palliative care coordinator, but you all would be able to answer this question. And I think it's very important. being in this field and working with people that have grief and loss every day, not just with, one person, but like with you, Roshni, you're working not just with the person that's passing, but also with the entire family. How do you cope with this? How do you separate your profession and your personal life without it impacting you as a person? Anybody want to?
Thank you for that question. That's a very important question to be talking about. I think I don't. It's just, that's just how my nervous system is wired. Over the years, I've learned how to not let it affect me as viscerally as it did when I started this work. But I don't think we ever leave untouched, by these amazing, heroic acts of loving and courage and suffering that we see. So I think for me, it's been reflective, a lot of self-reflection, journaling, having really good self-care practices. And, I'll be really honest and share it here. My career got to be so intense that I left my career. I needed to do something else. So I walked away, and that was a gift my patients gave me when they told me, your health is of the utmost importance. That was the message every day. So that meant that I couldn't work in that way in palliative care anymore. And, and we have to normalize, that we choose to do what is right for our body and lead with the body's wisdom. There's so much, shame and guilt among clinicians that, we have to be the sort of the torchbearers and, take on the burdens of everyone. So I hope, folks are considering, living a different life. It's okay. We're empathetic and highly sensitive people. And ultimately, we have to be safe and well in our bodies to be of service. Yeah, thank you for that question.
And you have to take care of yourself before you could take care of anybody else. That's for sure.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Monique, you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, so I agree. It's definitely, it's not separated. I feel a lot, and I'm in space with folks and very present in that, in what their experience is. Sometimes that experience is joy, sometimes that is a lot of deep pain. And so I do a lot of self-care and pay attention to what my capacity is as well, because most of my work is working with folks who've experienced a lot of trauma, intergenerational trauma, complex trauma, and a lot of grief. I'm now very aware of what my limitations are when it comes to how many folks I can support on a weekly basis, right? Also considering that my work is not just in the therapy room, but with my community, right? With my family, we're also experiencing things. So I have to make sure that I am balancing things out so I'm able to be of support when I'm able to, and also acknowledge when I'm not able to provide support and vocalize that and share that with folks. I'm not in a place right now. As I mentioned, I had a pregnancy last year, and there was several months that I could not provide support really to anybody. And I had to just let people know that I'm not able to do that. Some ways that I also take care of myself, sometimes, it's really heavy on my heart what someone is experiencing and they're very much in my thoughts. And so I burn medicine and I have a prayer for them. And I let them know that too. I'm going to have you in my prayers this evening, and where I'll share with them. And if it's in the next session, I kept doing my prayers. It was heavy on my heart too, because that human experience, and then knowing that I'm not just this distant person, I am actually supporting and in the space and holding it with we're in this together was very important. But I also want to model and share with them the ways in which I'm taking care of myself. And so it's been a learning lesson. I think over time, I've also started to recognize oh, this is sometimes it can get a bit much. So I have to always be very aware of what is my body signaling? What is even what's coming up in my dreams that is telling me, hey, you might need to take a step back. So paying attention in so many ways is really important to the work that I do regularly.
Pay attention to your body and your mind is what I'm hearing. Absolutely. Yes. Monique, did you want to end us with anything on that?
Yeah, thank you. I always sort of circle back to, humans have been doing this for thousands of years, and we know how to do this. And I also, it seems to me to come back around also to the idea of lived experience, and that the way that we grow our capacity for our own humanity is how we hold other people through their humanity. And if, sometimes I think the work of helping other people can be a way that we get away from our own, sitting with our own really depths. And in my experience, it seems like the larger our capacity for holding the unfixable things, the more that we can actually just be with people, human to human. And if there's tools that we have to share, that's wonderful if they're useful. But ultimately just getting back to what it's like to be human and holding, the really hard parts of that is I think what helps us to help other people.
Thank you, panelists. I think I could probably go all day long asking you guys questions. So I'm going to allow the audience to ask questions because I'm sure there's plenty. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Leora and see if we do have some questions from the audience.
Speaking of birth worker, I'm a question doula. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Teresa, for such beautiful space holding. We actually had a question from session 2 that lingers into this session, and one of the participants in session 2 asked, how can we live in holding 2 narratives? One, understanding the statistics that some folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, and folks of color have a higher exposure and likelihood to experience many types of grief, and also how do we grapple with that narrative and the stigma and expectation that is inevitable. And that's my own wording of that question, but I'm hoping that we can center it here, the both and, how do we hold some truth and also not name an experience, particularly in the way that we talk about Black, Indigenous, and folks of color grief.
I think for me, I really don't see distinction or tension. I think all grief is so individual. I think where I see a challenge is maybe BIPOC grief hasn't been centered or welcomed. It's been there aren't resources for it, or it hasn't been prioritized in the same way other folks can grieve and access and support. So I think for me it's just kind of equity in grieving, which is more cultural spaces for us to grieve in the way that feels right to us, that we don't have to sort of get an ICD code and have to go to this office or this group that's figured out by the hospice or the hospital. I think communal ways of grieving, I think would be my answer. Yeah, that rings true to me.
Anyone else? Thank you, Roshni, in terms of how to grapple with the narrative. I think there was a question around narrative that was coming up in session 2. Yeah.
I think, just echoing what was just shared is that community spaces and being in community, just being in community, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to be in a clinical setting. Actually, I think that the clinical settings are probably the worst settings for this process. But being in a space with community, and also oftentimes we think of grief, we do think of folks who have passed on. We're not always, it's not always the grieving of land or the grieving of our ecosystem. It's these are all things that are constantly happening, and also that we're that loss of, especially for communities of color, so like just having the space to be in community is huge, to be able to talk about it openly and to share and to resonate with one another. And that experience, and also learning from one another on what are some of those coping skills or things that folks are doing, like modeling, right? Like what are we modeling for one another? We really learn the most from our community. And so, yeah, that's huge, is having that space. And I think of different community spaces that I have been so grateful to be a part of, and how like there's always like an acknowledgement, even in like our opening prayers, of folks like both the present, the past, the present, and the future, right? And like keeping folks in our minds and in our hearts throughout our time. So it's never like we're never disconnected from, like we acknowledge that there are all these challenges, and also we are presently here in space together. So there's, yeah, I think being in community is huge. And there's not enough of that. At least I could say here in LA, it's like there is and there isn't. Like I know we have a lot of resources compared to maybe other communities, but I also feel like there's definitely not enough, right? Around community spaces. If you want to even talk about ceremonial spaces, like that's really, really challenging, especially in a city.
Monique, you just said something else to me. I'm sorry, Leora, that I'm just going to take with me today, because you said how uncomfortable it would be for someone to have to go into somebody's office and talk about these things. And that is so true. Yet, how long have we been doing it this way? You know, that is just something to think about.
Yeah.
Because I would much rather come to my safe space, to my safe haven, for me to be able to open up to talk about these things that I am hurt about, and to talk about it open and honestly. So, great point.
We got another question in session 1 that I think really holds such wisdom in this session, which is around the practice of restorative circles and centering lived experience and peer support in grief holding. And I'm curious if the three of you might share stories or share practices that center circles as a way to hold space.
I can just share a bit about that. So everything we do in our work is actually in circles. Circles, talking circles, you know, everything is in circles. So it's never not a thing. So I'll just say that it's huge and really important to the work that we do, the work that I do, is that we are in different spaces. And, you know, even as through Indigenous Circle Wellness, we have wellness circles that are not clinical, like there's not therapy. It's community being in space together that is really healing. And it's in circles. And even in these boxes on Zoom, like we will, you know, visualize and remember that we're in a circle space together. And there's no pathologizing, there's no offering of suggestions. It's really holding space and just being with one another. So yeah, I think we need, like, I feel like our Indigenous communities obviously have this down. We've been doing this like forever. I think Western psychology and just the Western world in general needs to, you know, get it together, because we know this works.
Yeah, a lot of my work that centers pregnancy loss and working with birthing people, a lot of that is circle work, because I really don't think, you know, there's like an expert person like telling us how to grieve. It's really a witnessing of everyone's story, and they know best like what happens in their body, like what is coming through, like what support they need. So I see it as, you know, sort of this like grandmotherly circle of like wisdom of our ancestors sort of coming through. And it's a ritual, and I see that as a ritual, and it's very important to call it a ritual, because again, it's not a pathology. It's a cultural way of sharing story and, you know, sharing comfort.
And it's a way of coming together as well. So
Exactly. Yeah, finding community in a very difficult, isolating experience.
Yeah. One last question, then I'm going to pass it back to Teresa to close. There's a question there's two, and then perhaps we'll see where we can go with it. One was if there might be, Monique, if you might share one more sentence about your work with folks who are survivors of death by suicide and lived experience there. And so just wanting to see if you might be able to share one or two sentences about your work with that specific community. And then there's another question around how might we also name all of our identities in addition to our race identities and our ethnicity in how it intersects with grief. And I know we've also been talking about other identities. So just wanting to put those two questions out there, and I'm going to go off video and then Teresa will close us after those. Thank you.
That last part just made me think of, you know, inviting in more of an understanding around our ancestral losses, and also, you know, the ways that they've modeled for better or worse sometimes how we grieve, and the intergenerational impact on what we have to grieve that might not be our experience but is ours to also grieve. And then the piece about the suicide loss, I do a retreat that is specific for mothers who have lost children by suicide every year. That was actually imagined by a mother who had lost her son by suicide and had went to a yoga retreat and kind of had an understanding of what she thought would be, you know, more supportive or different. And then I also do some groups with a friend of mine who it's a more general loss by suicide, but that has been really, you know, just the communal container and inviting in different ways that people can see what feels supportive to them.
thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, so I guess we are ready to wrap it up. You guys have been very inspiring, very wonderful. Thank you for sharing your personal stories, your practices. You've given me a lot to think about today. So thank you very much for the information. I wish we could do this ongoing. I hate that we can only do this in one day. There's just so much more I think that needs to be said. It needs to be talked about. So thank you so much for that, guys. Thank you.